The slow, cruel conflict in Ukraine will soon head into its third year, with the pressure on Kyiv to advance on the battlefield and re-energize support in the West. My guest from Berlin is Alexander Gabuev, director of the Carnegie Russia-Eurasia Center.
The bad news is that, unfortunately, the support for Ukraine in the Western public is going down.
For now, Russia's economy has stabilized, and Mr. Putin, indicted on war crimes charges, is nonetheless finding plenty of friends to talk to and visit. So will his newfound confidence tempt him into a bigger war with Ukraine and even a fight with NATO? Alexander Gabuev, welcome to Conflict Zone.
Thank you so much for having me.
A week ago, NATO's Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg warned the alliance to expect bad news from the war in Ukraine. He didn't say what. You've been taking a long, hard look at this war. Is Ukraine on the way to losing?
I don't think that Ukraine is on the way to losing now, but next year will definitely be crucial. And if Ukraine is not in a good position next year, that might shape the trajectory of the conflict towards loss of war by Ukrainian side.
So what we're seeing at the moment is the ebb and flow that you often see with major conflicts?
That's true, and I think that the comparison basis for this conflict could be World War I or the lengthy Iraq-Iran war. We are now seeing that Ukraine has lost the initiative. It's pushing on some directions without major gains. Its summer counteroffensive has not yielded in major combat victories. And then the Russians are now on advance with terrible losses on their side of both material and equipment. But Russians are advancing. And what's more, Russians have a lot of money pumped into their military-industrial complex and into recruiting new soldiers. So now the material advantage is gradually on the Russian side. And without massive support for Ukraine, we might be seeing this conflict on a trajectory for Russia's victory, even if Putin doesn't achieve his maximalistic objectives in this conflict.
Let's talk about the chances of massive support for Ukraine, because last month NATO foreign ministers tried to put the best face on the situation. They promised unwavering support, as they put it, as the Ukrainians bravely defend their country. The figures tell a different story, don't they? Not quite adding up to unwavering support. An EU plan to provide Kyiv with 50 billion euros in budget support, that's stuck in committee. A $60 billion fund promised by the White House is stuck in Congress. This is bad news, isn't it?
The bad news is that, unfortunately, the support for Ukraine in the Western public is going down. And then it also became a source for politics making for domestic purposes in the US and also for intra-European Union conflict between Hungarian leadership and the rest of the Union inside the EU. We are talking at the moment when President Zelenskyy is scheduled to arrive in Washington, D.C. He's most likely to speak to the leadership of the Senate and the Congress. He is about to see President Biden. So I think that the amount of support of the U.S. and the timing, whether the Ukrainians get the money they need to defend themselves for next year, is up in the air. The fact that it's not kind of a guaranteed and very well-scheduled train of support is a bad news, but I think that it's too early to be desperate. But I think that the very warning side is that it's most likely will be the last massive package for the next year. And the question is how wisely the Ukrainians are to spend it.
Later this week, EU leaders meet in Brussels with the possibility of making an historic decision to open accession talks with Ukraine. Hungary has threatened to block the move. You mentioned Hungary a moment ago. Either way, decisions there at this meeting could decide the outcome of this war, couldn't they? Arms supplies to Ukraine have already been drastically affected, haven't they?
I think that it's not deciding the outcomes of this war, but I think that if we don't have a positive decision, massive aid package of support for Ukraine, then the trajectory of the conflict is going into negative direction for Kyiv. And despite the bravery of Ukrainian defendants and the resilience of Ukraine as a society, without massive influx of Western material support, the situation will be pretty dire.
The Kyiv Institute for the World Economy said on December the 7th, newly committed aid to Ukraine reached a new low between August and October this year, an almost 90% drop compared to the same period last year. The Kremlin must be jumping for joy, isn't it?
The Kremlin is, and we've seen President Putin gloating around that in his meeting with Russian senior military staff. He was awarding Heroes of Russia awards a couple of days ago, and he said that Ukraine doesn't have its own economy, doesn't have its own defense base, and this is why the trajectory of the conflict is in Russia's favor. He might be wrong long term, but he's unfortunately right now, and it's everything in the hands of Western political leadership to prove Mr. Putin wrong.
The White House National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said last week that any shortfall in funding would quickly compromise Ukraine's air defense capabilities. In your view, how long does Ukraine have to get the weapons it's calling for before its troops not only fail to advance, but actually begin to retreat?
There is a discussion inside Ukrainian senior military leadership and the political leadership, as well as among friends of Ukraine in the West, what's the best strategy Ukraine should follow right now. Because Russia is heavily dug in, material advantage is on the Russian side. Whether it makes sense for Ukraine to try to break through the Russian lines, given how exhausted its troops are, or the better approach for now is not to chase counteroffensives next year, but dig in, fortify defenses, be able to rotate the troops, do another round of mobilization, train more troops, and then come more prepared probably in 2025. I think that's a heavily debated issue right now. And depending on the decisions that the Kyiv military leadership and political leadership will take, we'll see how they will go about this.
Whatever happened to all those extravagant promises that Ukraine received over the last 20 months, which were fulsome and in many ways unique? Look at the way the EU morphed almost overnight into an organization that supplies military hardware. Look at the change of heart in Germany, the much publicized Titan vendor, turning point in history that Chancellor Scholz spoke of. Was there, in your view, always a timeline attached to the West's largesse? Moscow has always believed that, hasn't it?
Moscow indeed banks on the fact that Western support for Ukraine will evaporate at some point, that Moscow has much more at stake given Mr. Putin's obsession over this war, and given how seemingly united the society is behind this war. I think that based on work done by my colleagues at Carnegie Endowment, Andrei Kolesnikov, and our partner sociologist Denis Volkov, we see that around 20% are diehard supporters for this war on the Russian side, and about 50% are very passive and will go to whatever direction there is. So on the Russian side, you have economic growth, you have increased military production, and you have focus, because this war is the organizing principle of Russia's foreign policy and domestic politics right now. The Russian hope is that the West at some point will pack and leave. And again, it's totally up to the Western leadership and to societies to help Ukraine to stand in this battle, because I think that we have some communication gaps, because Western leaders have explained to their societies why it's so crucial to support Ukraine, and I think that more questions are aroused. So there is a need for a new round of explanation why this conflict is so existential to Western interests.
The EU Council President Charles Michel was asked on this program about Europe's commitment to Ukraine. He said the EU would stand by Ukraine for as long as it takes to secure victory. Do you think such promises were made in good faith?
They are, but at the same time, we don't have a very clear definition of what victory is that also is achievable.
We know what a loss is, don't we? We certainly know what a loss is.
We definitely know what the loss is. And the loss is when Ukraine doesn't achieve any of its objectives. And the cost of this war is borne by both Russia and Ukraine, but cost on the Ukrainian side will be much bigger. I think that right now, part of the discussion that we are having is that how realistic are the definitions for victory put out by President Zelenskyy, which is 1991 borders, including Crimea, reparations, so Russia should pay for the damage, and accountability for war criminals, including both senior Russian leadership and President Vladimir Putin. How achievable is that if we are dealing with a nuclear power is questionable. And I think that here, the Western leadership has, in a smart way, because there is no other way to tell Ukrainians what the definition of victory should be, have pushed this to Kyiv leadership itself to say that, Ukrainian leadership should define what victory constitutes and will be there with them till the end. Now, I think it's the reconning time for Ukrainian leadership itself to define how realistic those goals are and what is the strategy to achieve something which will be tangible.
The Ukrainian leadership sticks to the position that it's not going to give up any land. On the contrary, it wants the land back. That looks increasingly unachievable, doesn't it?
I don't think that it's feasible to imagine that any Ukrainian leadership will legally abandon any territory occupied by Russia, be it Ukraine or be it other 4 regions that have been partially occupied and then annexed by Russia late next year. But there could be other ways to frame this issue and to say that war will not necessarily be over, unfortunately, even if Ukraine achieves its 1991 borders. What prevents Russia from shooting over the 1991 borders? It's not that Ukrainians will regain territorial integrity of their countries as recognized by the international community, and then Vladimir Putin will say, sorry, I'm lost, you won, I'm packing and going home, or buying myself a plane ticket to The Hague. So what's the realistic way to...
I'm sorry to interrupt. He can't go home empty-handed, can he, Putin?
No, he cannot. And we can imagine a scenario where he loses the war and stays in power, like Saddam Hussein after his debacle in Kuwait. But it's unlikely, knowing how much Vladimir Putin banks on his legacy over annexation of Crimea and other parts of Ukraine.
Mr. Gabuev, the Kremlin appears to have stabilized after Yevgeny Prighozhin's infamous mutiny and the rather predictable plane crash that he suffered. But will there have been murmurings that Putin showed unexpected weakness under pressure? Might someone have already decided that all they need to do is give him another push and maybe they could clear the path to someone else taking over in the Kremlin? Do you think thoughts like that are crystallizing at the moment among Russian leaders?
No, I think that these hopes are futile. I understand why people want to see somebody taking care of the world's Vladimir Putin problem, but that's unfortunately not happening. To the contrary, Prighozhin's mutiny has only fortified Mr. Putin's grip on power. He has eliminated the most dangerous rival that he also self-created and procrastinated for the problem to get bigger and bigger. But now this problem is fixed. Everybody in the elite got the message, and everybody is not rallied around Mr. Putin willingly, but they understand what price they will pay if they ultimately step up against Mr. Putin.
You yourself wrote in July how the mutiny had exposed what you called the fragility of Putin's power system. People won't have forgotten that fragility, will they? What amounts to a danger for the leader, and Putin was by all accounts in some danger, is always an opportunity for opponents, isn't it? That's just politics, isn't it?
It's fragility of the regime for sure, but time and again we see that Mr. Putin is learning some lessons and that the system is adaptable. Remember how miserable Russia looked at the battlefield at the very beginning of this conflict, where Ukrainians grimly being in far less advantageous position, just pushed back and smashed a lot of Russians who had material superiority. And yet, right now, we see that Russians are learning the lessons and able to turn the tide. something similar has happened to the political system. Yes, the mutiny has shown how fragile the system is, but Mr. Putin can fix some of these issues.
You warned last summer that far from seeking a so-called off-ramp from his war in Ukraine, Putin is preparing for an even bigger war. Do you still feel that way? And if so, how big might this war be?
Exactly. That's exactly what we're seeing now. Mr. Putin will invest 6% of GDP to defense and to war needs in Ukraine. 40% of Russian budget next year will go to defense and security. That's more than at any given moment since collapse of the Soviet Union. He is increasing the troops numbers, and his military industry is working on 3 ships, producing materials to defeat Ukraine. So I think that for now, the war is contained in Ukraine. If he is victorious, I don't believe that he will be able to achieve his maximalistic goal to put a friendly government in Kyiv. But if he's not deterred, I would say that the risk for further challenges, hybrid challenges to the Baltic states or to some Eastern flank countries is unfortunately not entirely zero.
So when Joe Biden says if Putin takes Ukraine, he won't stop there, and then we'll have something that we don't seek and that we don't have today, American troops fighting Russian troops. Do you believe that that is a possibility, even a distant one?
If anybody would say to me 2 years ago, I would say, oh, get your head exact. Like, Russia is very serious about NATO Article 5 commitment. It's definitely understanding the power symmetry between itself and NATO. So no, NATO is not at risk at all. Right now, I'm not so sure. If he is victorious in Ukraine, if he sees that Ukraine is a broken country and he can occupy the land with impunity, and there is a leader like Donald Trump who challenges the utility of NATO to American interests, the temptation to kind of challenge Article 5 will be there. I still think that the risk is low for direct confrontation between Russia and the US, but the risk is unfortunately going up rapidly.
But if he were to discover that Article 5 isn't worth the paper it's written on, NATO's finished, isn't it?
That's absolutely true, and that might be the temptation on the Russian side. So many people were wrong about Putin's plans to invade Ukraine because, objectively speaking, if you are a rational pragmatist, the list of downsides for Russia is just so long. It has killed thousands of its people, including its most professional military. It's sanctioned, it's isolated from the world, it's becoming junior partner of China. But Mr. Putin is not deterred, and his grip on authority in Russia is strengthened. So what if his course is proven to be a winning course, at least for himself, and he can impose this vision on the Russian elites? The temptation to challenge Article 5 in NATO and chase the Americans out of Europe will be growing. Mr. Putin is not getting younger. He's not getting any rational. So the risks are not zero, unfortunately.
This might be the itch that he can't stop scratching, you mean, in other words?
Yeah, and this is exactly why getting serious about defense and getting serious about Zeitenwende and all the promises that were made 2 years ago when Russia invaded Ukraine, I think are really very necessary to fulfill, not only to support Ukraine, but for Europe's own security. Containment is the way to go forward, unfortunately.
Let's look, if we may, at Putin's friendship with China. You wrote last spring that thanks to the war in Ukraine, Russia and China are now closer allies than at any time in the two countries' modern history. Do you believe that Putin's new best friend, Xi Jinping, would go along with the idea of a bigger war?
I think that Mr. Xi Jinping couldn't care less where the conflict between, where the border or the contact line between Russia and Ukraine is, as long as this war doesn't go nuclear and he is not blamed to support that. He respects American red lines, which have been communicated to him. No kinetic military direct support, no military material. And by and large, he follows that line. If Russia is weakened, isolated, and more aligned and subordinate to China, what's the bad news for him? He only likes this situation.
What about Putin's other foreign friends? Suddenly he's popping up in the UAE and Saudi Arabia, where he was greeted as a very dear guest of the kingdom. In Moscow, he's been putting out the red carpet for foreign leaders like the president of Iran. So much for the international isolation that was expected to follow his indictment for war crimes charges. Is he just flaunting his impunity, or is he busy putting together a new anti-Western axis?
3 quick points. I think that the illusion about the global unity in isolating Russia, it's just illusion and it's a fantasy. It's very easy to cast abstenee or a vote criticizing Russia in the UN General Assembly, but so many countries in the global south, not only China, but also the largest democracy in the world, India, are having a beneficial commercial relationship with Russia, and they're not abandoning Vladimir Putin. Same goes for countries in the Gulf, including UAE and Saudi Arabia. To receiving Putin with this symbols of prestige and welcome is also a way to show to the West that this region has friends, and this is tied to the Western handling of Gaza crisis and war between Israel and Hamas. And then finally, yes, Mr. Putin is trying to put this coalition together, what he's called the global majority. I don't think that anybody in the global south is really believing Mr. Putin when he says that his brutal war against Ukraine is a rebellion against U.S. hegemony. But so many countries are following that narrow, pragmatic interests and blaming the West on double standards. They say, what about Iraq? What about Afghanistan? And frankly, there is not that much introspection that will convince these countries that Russia's war against Ukraine is entirely different level of violation of international norms.
To what extent, I mean, you talked a bit about the Russian economy. To what extent have improvements in that economy helped to keep the Russian people, if not on side, then at least not protesting? The people who protested, hundreds of thousands of them have gone, haven't they? They've left the country. But somehow they seem to have realigned or coalesced around the Kremlin, haven't they? Is that the economy?
We have the estimate of roughly 500,000 people leaving Russia for good, me included. For a country of more than 140 million, that's not too much. And these are people who are employable in global markets. There are so many people who want to leave Russia but couldn't because of visa restrictions and many other policies. For the remaining people, it's a mix of violence because protesting has a very top price. You see Alexei Navalny, you see so many thousands of brave Russians who have dared to protest this war and have been beaten and imprisoned and so on. The Russian society is atomized, and Mr. Putin is building his regime on this level of atomization and lack of unity. But then another element to this is really the economic prosperity, because the war has made a lot of low middle income families really receiving a lot of money because the government is paying people to go to the front lines. It's giving hefty cash outs for families wounded and killed. So it is a rational strategy for somebody to go to fight in Ukraine because his families will be provided.
You mentioned briefly the Gaza war. It obviously diverts US weapons and ammunition from Ukraine to Israel, and it also leaves America increasingly isolated diplomatically. So it's a clear benefit to Putin, isn't it? There's no downside for him in this war.
It's a clear benefit to Mr. Putin that he hasn't created. There is no credible evidence that he was in any way involved in Hamas attack, but he's definitely taken a increasingly one-sided pro-Hamas stance. He is not executing the even balanced Russian foreign policy, not that much sympathy for the victims of horrible October 7 attacks. And yes, the U.S. resources are diverted to Israel. Attention of U.S. senior policymakers, including President Biden himself and his national security team, is diverted to the Middle East. And then the double standards of the West are something that Mr. Putin has preach to the global south, and he has fertile ground there.
So very briefly, does that mean Moscow is ending the year on something of a high, looking better than it did a year ago?
If you look back, 2023 has been a really surprisingly good year for Mr. Putin. And it's really in the hands of the Western policymaker to make sure that 2024 is not as good for him.
Alexander Gabuev, it's been good to have you on Conflict Zone. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.